you're here, you want the very quick explanation of the Texas contracts. Watch until the end. It'll be a very quick video, but I'm going to address the most common questions that you're going to have. Okay, so I'm going to jump right in and we are going to check out the Texas contracts real quick. All right, just want to make sure that, yes, awesome. All right, so these contracts were put out and made officially required to be used April of 2021. This is the seller, this is the buyer, legal description, street address, okay? Then you have anything that doesn't stay, we would have to enter it here, or seller would. Then we have down payment plus loan equals sales price. Cash is the down payment, loan financing is the what you're borrowing from your lender. So A plus B equals C. If there's any lease, if the tenant seller is renting out the house, they have to give you copies of the lease. If there's anything like water softener, solar panels that are leases, or even alarm systems, we would check that. Now, natural resources, we usually don't see that just because we don't have like oil fields or anything like that anywhere near El Paso, okay? So this would be earnest money. It would be payable to the title company. And then this would have the name of the title officer and the address. This also would have the money that the buyer would pay the seller for the unrestricted right to cancel during the first whatever days are in this box right here under B. So we execute a contract. If there's an option period, let's say 5 days or 7 days or 10 days, whatever is negotiable and agreed to. The day one of the option period starts the day after we execute the contract. During that time frame of whatever days is here, the buyer has the unrestricted right to cancel. For the most part, buyers use that time to get the house inspected and to negotiate repairs. Okay. Now, the rule is you can't get something for nothing. So you've got to put a certain amount in here that you're paying for that. Whatever you put in here is completely negotiable between seller and buyer, and there's no rule that it has to be any specific amount. Okay. Now, for the most part, we see anywhere between $50 and $100, sometimes $200 on the option period. Earnest money can be anywhere from $500 all the way up to, you know, the sky's the limit, right? So depending on the terms of the offer. Now, the termination option ends at 5 p.m. on the last day of this period in the time zone in which the house is located. Now, you don't deliver earnest money, the seller can cancel. You don't deliver the option money, you don't have an option for the buyer. Title policy, the seller or the buyer will pay for the title policy, gives a list of all the different things that it doesn't cover. Won't cover if you get a mortgage and you don't make your payments. Doesn't cover if you don't pay your taxes, or if you get divorced and you fight for whoever gets the house. Those are the kind of things that the title doesn't cover. It does cover against any kind of lenders coming back later saying, oh, well, I put a pool in and I never got paid, and so I filed a lien on the property, that sort of thing, okay? Commitment, that's just like a summary of any liens that the title company finds on the property right off the get-go. They've got 20 days to submit that. Buyer can review it. They could put in writing any objections they have, and the objections would be a little further down right here on letter D. Going back up to survey, who pays for the survey? Survey shows the boundaries, shows any kind of utility easements, shows where the fence, rock wall, the property ends, that sort of thing. Now, if the seller has a copy, then we could check that the buyer, they've got so many days to give a copy and a form called a T47 that certifies that nothing has changed on the survey. If they can't use that, then we would check whether the seller or the buyer will provide a new one. Or if there's no survey, with the buyer or the seller provide a new one, right? Now, if the buyer wants to buy the property to use for something specific outside of a home, we would enter it here. Let's say they want to buy it and put a pool in. So we would put a pool, or we would put nursing home or chicken farm or whatever, right? And these are the days that the buyer has to put in writing any objections they have on the survey or the title. Now, abstract of title, if buyer's worried about who really owns the property, they can hire their own attorney to do to check on the chain of ownership. I've never seen that happen. It can, but I've rarely seen it happen. Homeowners Association. This basically says that if the house is in an HOA, we'd have to check one of those, and the buyer has to get copies of the information on those restrictions. If there's a special tax district, they have to get the information. We don't have to worry about tidewaters because we're not beachfront. We also don't have to worry about water level fluctuations because we don't have a whole lot of lakes here. If the house is not part of the city, it can be annexed. If there's a special utility service provider, we would have to provide the information. Also, public improvement districts. A lot of these things we typically don't see in El Paso. There's a transfer fee. We have to disclose that. However, in El Paso, really the only thing that we see a transfer fee would be like a condo, right? Or a townhome, maybe. Propane gas system, if there's not city gas. Water level fluctuations, that's lakefront property. Seller has to give the buyer reasonable access to the property. We normally see 8 to 8 so that they can get inspections, and they have to have all utilities on. Buyer has or has not received seller's disclosure. Texas requires that the seller disclose anything that they know about the property. There's only 4 exceptions to that rule. If it's a foreclosure, if it's an inheritance, like a probate, if it's a property that is sold between a spouse and a like a divorcing spouse or family member, then where they both have lived in the property. And I can't remember what the 4th exception is, but there's only certain reasons that keeps them from not having to do that. Okay. Seller's disclosure on lead-based paint. If the house was built on or before 1978, there's a good chance there's lead-based paint under many other layers of paint. All right, so if you're worried about that, I've got a pamphlet that explains a little bit more in detail the risks and how it gets, how people can get lead-based paint poisoning, okay? This is the biggest thing that people get freaked out about. This says that the buyer will buy the house as is. Now, they do have a termination option. That's that option that we talked about earlier. Just because you're checking as is does not mean that they will not try to renegotiate repairs during that option, okay? That's a given. Now, if the buyer only wants to ask for specific things, then they would check this number 2 and list those. Most buyers don't know what's wrong with the property because they don't have an inspection report most of the time. So it's hard to ask for specific repairs. Now, but again, that's what the option period is for. If the appraiser goes in and requires certain repairs to be done that haven't been addressed already, then they can renegotiate buyer and seller. If they do not come to an agreement, then they have the right to cancel. Now, completion of repairs and treatments, that is if they negotiate for repairs to be done, the buyer has a right to go in and check for those items. And they must, if they want to ensure that they get done and they get done properly, because once we close, it's very hard to get the seller to come back. That's why it's very important to check for those. Now, if it's something really big that takes a long time, there's automatically a 5-day extension to complete the repairs. Now, if they're extensive and over 5% of the value of the sales price of the house, then again, up here, then the buyer has the right to terminate 5% of the sales price, okay? Environmental matters, if a buyer's worried about them, they can hire an inspector to do those specialized things. Residential service contract, that's a home warranty, usually covers heating, cooling, plumbing, electrical within the house, different coverages, different limitations, different companies. Make sure that they are licensed in Texas. This blank would be that the buyer would purchase or the seller would pay for, right? But the seller would reimburse the buyer up to this amount of money for the purchase of a home warranty. Okay, usually it's done at closing, but it's not the title company's responsibility. So if you want the home warranty, make sure you let me know. And then basically anything above that, if the buyer added a bunch of extra coverages, then the buyer would have to pay the difference. Now, this says that if anybody involved in the real estate transaction is actually a licensed realtor or a licensed agent, we have to disclose. And any kind of commissions paid to the realtors are in a separate agreement. This says that closing will happen on or before this date. If everybody agrees to close sooner, then that's fine. And this also says that at closing, seller will sign all the necessary documents, relay clean title, which the title company does for them. There's not going to be any liens on the property. Buyer will sign any kind of loan documents necessary and bring to the table any cash needed. Same with the seller. Possession will happen upon closing and funding. Closing happens when you sign. Funding happens usually a day or 2 after that. And that the reason is original documents have to be signed. They email a copy to the lender to confirm everything looks correct. Once they secure that, then they send the wire. There's cutoff times with wires for the banks. So the wire cutoff time for the lender, for their bank, for the title company to receive it, for the title company bank, okay? So make sure that you check with me for when you will get keys if you're a buyer, because too many times people plan for the moving ban the day of closing, and you might not get keys. So make sure you check with me ahead of time. Smart devices, if the seller has an alarm system, lighting, anything that is done with an app on their phone or an Android or whatever, they have to release that information to the buyer so that they can take it over. And they also have to remove those apps from their phones or their smart devices and not have access to that anymore. That's much more of a common issue now. If there's something specific that the buyer or the seller want to include in the contract that is not already in there, or there's not already a form for it, then it would go here. We have to be very careful about what we put in here, because if we repeat something, then we're actually practicing law. And that's a big no-no in Texas. All right, settlement and other expenses. This says that if the seller agrees to pay the buyer's closing costs, that specific amount would be here. You cannot say 3%. You cannot be vague. You have to be very specific, because whatever does not get used here does not get it's not like a check that gets written to the buyer, okay? So the seller will pay up to a certain amount of money for closing costs or zero. And then there's a list of fees in which those that money can be paid for. It cannot go for down payment, and it doesn't get doesn't become a check written to the buyer at closing. Okay. Now, and it's of course, if it's an FHA or VA loan, there's certain things that are allowed to be paid for from those closing costs. Prorations, the seller will be responsible for taxes up to the day of closing. So what happens in that instance is the title company will prorate that amount, pull it from the seller's proceeds, then credit it to the buyer. The buyer's lender will usually put that in the escrow account, so that from the moment they close and on, when the buyer's making their payments, that's, a certain amount of money that goes towards taxes and insurance goes into the escrow. So at the end of the year, when taxes are paid, so because taxes are paid in arrears, taxes are paid until December for the year that just passed, there will be enough money in that account to pay for that, okay? If anything happens to the property, it's the seller's responsibility to bring it back up to speed before closing. They can always extend an extra 15 days if it's difficult. The issue we see a lot is like title, the roof. If there's a roof hail damage, we have to make sure that we address this issue so that the buyer can either get the roof done after closing, or the check will be paid to the buyer's roofer, or whatever the case may be. If anybody fails to comply with the contract, they are in default. And if there's a disagreement, everybody agrees to go to mediation first. It's cheaper and it's faster. And if they have a disagreement and they wind up in court, then the loser may have to pay the winner's attorney's fees. Escrow, title company is a neutral party. They're not a part of this contract. They will hold earnest money. They will do closing, but they cannot be liable for losses of earnest money or anything like that. At closing, earnest money will be applied first to the buyer's down payment, then their closing costs. If it's like a VA loan where there's no down payment and the seller paid all the closing costs, then that money, any extra monies will be refunded to the buyer. If there's a disagreement, they cancel the contract, we have to put in writing who the earnest money will be refunded to. If, let's say, it ends poorly and the seller wants the earnest money and they put it in writing, then the title company will send a copy of that demand to the buyer. Buyer has 15 days to respond. If they don't, then the money will get sent to the seller. If the buyer does respond and they disagree and there's no signed off distribution of that, then it sits in limbo until they do. Representations, all covenants, representations, warranties survive the contract. If the seller's a foreign national, the title company will pull a certain amount of money from their proceeds for the IRS, so that when they file their tax returns, then the IRS will settle that issue with them. IRS always gets their money. Notifications to sellers and buyers are made here in these sections. Any other items that are attached to this contract will be listed here. So if the buyer's getting a loan, third-party financing, if there is a lead-based paint requirement disclosure, it's included here. If the buyer is asking for a refrigerator and washer and dryer, we would check this box and add the form that addresses that, which is the non-realty items addendum. If there's an attorney for either buyer or seller, we would enter it here. Most of the time, I just put to be determined, because there usually is no need for an attorney, but it's the client's right. And then once everybody agrees on all items in here, there's been any changes are initialed by both parties, any blanks are filled in that are necessary. Once everybody initials and signs off on this, then we can execute, we can date the contract. Then as soon as everybody gets a copy of the contract, then it becomes an official contract. Before that, it's still just an offer, okay? So this will list the people involved in the contract, buyer's agent, seller's agents, and then this shows how the buyer's agent will be compensated. And then this form basically breaks down the receipts for option and earnest money. So I know it's a lot. I hope I explained most of it. If you want a much more detailed explanation, go to my YouTube channel. I have a 40-minute plus video that explains every paragraph in this contract. And I hope this helps. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye. Little reminder that my business is based on referrals. Without wonderful people such as yourself, I could not keep my business running. So if you happen to know of anybody, friend, family, coworker, neighbor, that is interested in buying, selling, or investing in real estate, I would love to give them the best level of personal care. Thanks so much. Feel free to reach out, text, email, or call me. Thanks. Bye-bye.